Okay, so thank you all very much for coming. Welcome to the final seminar of the term, which precedes our Christmas party. So I'll announce that at the beginning so that you can move seamlessly on at the end. But in the intervening period, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Aimee Middlemiss to give the seminar today. Aimee is one of our prized Wellcome Early Career Research Fellows here in the Centre, and her current research project is around the reproductive politics of the cervical stitch, a procedure used in pregnancy to try to prevent preterm birth or miscarriage. And this is part of a kind of very clearly thematic sequence, if you like. So previously, she has researched into pregnancy loss, thinking about managing pregnancy risk, also midwifery provision. She describes her work as feminist, qualitative, interdisciplinary social science, drawing on sociology, anthropology, and science and technology studies. And as you'll have noticed, she is interested in both reproduction and death, and particularly into the concepts of personhood and kinship, and thinking about these in terms of politics and policy, as well as more abstractly or theoretically. And it's very much these intersections that she's going to be talking about today. So she, he, it, sexing and gendering the dead fetal being. Aimee.
Thank you very much. So obviously this is like a slightly difficult topic, so just dip out if you find it a bit much. I think hopefully you can tell by the title what it's going to involve. So this is actually a pretty, oh no, I'll stay on that one, sorry. Pretty developed paper based on my PhD research. A lot of my PhD research is published elsewhere, but this stuff hasn't been. And I'm kind of hoping to get it into Body and Society. I'm going to try and submit it after Christmas with hopefully some feedback from you all. So I'm going to present it as it's written and hopefully you can follow it, but I'm going to start with the methods so you've got an idea of where it's all coming from. So for this paper, I'm drawing on multi-sited ethnographic fieldwork that I did in 2018, 2019, and this was for my PhD. It's investigating, it turned out in the end, the reproductive politics of second trimester pregnancy loss in England. And I have published that as a monograph. So the methods included participant observation at memorial events, document and material culture analysis, and interviews with 31 women in the southwest England who had at least one experience of second trimester pregnancy loss. And this is between 13 and 24 completed weeks of pregnancy out of 14 weeks of pregnancy. And the sort of losses that they'd had were spontaneous fetal deaths, which are sometimes known as miscarriage, spontaneous premature labours before viability, which resulted in fetal or neonatal death. And that's a sort of what we traditionally call a miscarriage, and also termination for fetal anomaly. And these were held together by the idea of loss, but also by the way that they're managed in the English state-funded NHS. So in the English NHS, in those circumstances, you're almost always required to undergo a labour and birth. And this is the standard practice in the NHS of those gestations. There isn't a surgical option. So the interviews involved participants telling me the story of their pregnancy loss or losses in informal conversation. And the discussion of sexing and gendering came up spontaneously in the interviews or in the discussion of memorial items sometimes happened during the interviews. And I followed this up at the time. And it didn't form part of the narrative of the book. It's sort of mentioned in there, but not in detail. And I then did another analysis involving coding on themes related to sexing and gendering the fetus or baby. And this analysis this paper is based on that. Just a bit of background, all the participants but one of the participants were white British. And this is because of the limited racial diversity of Southwest England where this was based. They were in heterosexual relationships at the time of the pregnancy loss and in the age range of 25 to 48. They had a broad range of educational levels and employment types. Most of them had no religion, but 6 had connections to Christianity or were Christians, and 5 described themselves as having spiritual beliefs. And I offered interview participants choices about the level of anonymity that they'd like in the research findings, and you'll see that at the end of the presentation. So, when a new baby's announced, the next question to be asked is it a girl or a boy? And this slots the new person and their family into an existing social order through processes of sexing and gendering. But some families have experiences that are disruptive to the normative processes of making a new person. And one example is pregnancy loss in later pregnancy, when wanted or accepted fetuses or babies die. And in the English NHS, there's usually this labour and birth, and that means there's often an encounter with a formed fetal body. And women and families who go through this have a range of responses, and some of them claim forms of personhood for the fetal being or baby, although others deliberately don't invoke fetal personhood. And that was basically my PhD. So in this paper, I'm drawing on this data to discuss how fetal beings which have died or will die are produced or not produced as forms of person through answers to the girl or boy question. So a little bit of background to the processes of sexing fetal and newborn bodies. So sexing the fetal and newborn body can happen at different scales. Firstly, at the level of anatomy, sexing can derive from the visual appearance external genitalia in relation to normative morphology. So this is a kind of traditional have a look between the legs and the nouns, whatever. So it can also be done in ultrasound visualization of fetal genitalia in routine prenatal scanning. So basically, in that case, you're looking for the presence or absence of a penis after a certain stage of development. And that's about 95% accurate at 20 weeks of gestation. So under the 24-week cutoff that my participants were talking about. So also at 20 weeks of gestation, this is the fetal anomaly check, which is done by ultrasound, and it takes place in NHS pregnancy care at around this time before you get to 24 weeks. And fetal sexing isn't part of that. It's not a formal part of that process, but because that process is actually looking for congenital abnormalities of the fetal body, but it is locally offered by trusts at the request of the pregnant woman. So that's one type of sexing. And then there's another form of sexing that happens at the level of chromosomal makeup. And this can also be diagnosed prenatally using amniocentesis, chorionic villus sampling, or non-invasive prenatal testing. And all of those use various methods to sample fetal cells within the pregnant body. And you can also use chromosomal sexing after postnatally. For example, if a born living baby has ambiguous genitals, then you might have a process by which this was brought about. Or you can also have this happen posthumously during post-mortem. So this is really significant for my cohort of people, obviously. So during post-mortem, there's a general chromosome analysis, which is often done to try and determine the cause of pregnancy loss because it often is chromosomal. So as a sort of side product of that, you usually find out, or you can usually find out sex, chromosomal sex. So significantly, in cases of ambiguous genitals in a living baby, chromosomal sex is considered more determinative than perceived anatomical sex. So this is referring to some intersex literature. And this is an example of Rose's molecularization of life, in which truth is located at a scale which can only be perceived by science. And this leads us to the politics of sexing. Who does sexing, when and how it's done is really significant. So prenatal sexing, either whether it's anatomical, morphology related, or through ultrasound or in other ways, comes about through biotechnology and biomedical experts. And the sexing of living babies can be done by parents at birth, and they're the ones that declare sex at civil registration in relation to the state. But biomedical professionals carry out examinations at birth and also at 6 weeks in England. And if there's any doubt about sex, it becomes a diagnostic process. So then it comes back into biomedicine. So sex attribution is therefore a diagnostic process of classification in the context of normality and abnormality. And as with all diagnoses, it entails social and political consequences. Some of those are concerned with bureaucracies of personhood. So although a living baby is registered by the parents with the state, the medical staff, like midwives, fill out an official legal birth notification directly after a live birth. And this is separate to the civil registration process, but it does match up at some point in the bureaucratic whatever. And it requires them to state what it says on the form as gender of the baby as female, male, not known or not specified. So you have various options in that situation, and leaving some time in case there is any ambiguity before the actual declaration and civil registration. So sex is therefore a categorizing label attached to a person even before a name has been declared. And this information about sex is bureaucratically matched with the details of the registering parents at civil birth registration, when the new person's name is recorded, their place of birth, and the details of their parents. In cases of stillbirth, so this is a death during pregnancy after 24 weeks in the UK, and the definitions are different places. So if this doesn't, not the same as France, for example. So 24 weeks in the UK after that it would be classed as a stillbirth, and whether it would be a stillbirth, whether it was spontaneous or whether it was a termination, it still comes under that category. And after that in that situation, sex is also recorded on the required legal form completed by medical staff. But it's sex in that case, not gender, and there is an option of unknown besides the male and female categories. So prior to viability, this 24-week gestation cut-off in the English context, which is the period that I'm concerned about, unless there's a live birth, sex and gender are not reportable to the state. And there are sometimes live births, but there's usually a death pretty soon afterwards. Births like this in the population relevant categories of the beings that they produce aren't reportable because they don't produce the normative outcome of a living citizen in ongoing relation to the state. And that was basically my book. So that last bit, not all of that. So trying to pin down sex and gender categorizations in the newborn is embedded in biomedicine, in the state's social recognition of the baby as a citizen, and in the biopolitics of population. And ambiguous cases have been really repeatedly connected to ontological ideas about what sex or potentially gender a person really is in biomedical and kinship contexts. But the relationship between classificatory categories of sex and gender is a shifting one, and the concepts are frequently conflated in biomedicine and other governance. And sex has been understood by some people to be different from gender identity, with sex being based in the body's anatomy and physiology, and gender being a social self-experience based on biological sex categories. But also this has been questioned in terms of whether there are serious divisions between the two concepts and what the foundational directionality between the two might be. So I'm kind of referring to Butler and Faustus Sterling and Weston Zimmerman and Lecoeur and people like that here. So, for example, in intersex studies, binary social ideas about gender have been shown to influence the biomedical sexing decisions. And in transgender surgery, gender is presumed to precede sex, and the sex body is then brought into line with desired gender, which is referencing Gonzalez there. So, directionality of gender being built on sex is challenged in these cases. And one of the ways that it's challenged is through who does the sexing and gendering. And intersex and transgender literature centres the agency of those who don't neatly embody the required categories. So referencing Faustin Sterling and Davis, Feinberg and Meadow. So how sexing and gendering happens is of interest, and so is who gets to declare and decide sex, gender. Biomedicine, the state, the kin, or the affected person. So why is this important in pregnancy, birth and loss? Literature from the social science of reproduction recognises that sexing the fetus using ultrasound is a significant feature of contemporary pregnancy for many families, including for sex-selective abortion. And knowing sex prenatally is considered to produce a more real fetal being and an incipient biography associated with status as a baby rather than a fetus. So it's connected to personhood, and in contemporary Euro-American cultures, that is located in the biology of the individual, onto which social relations are attached. And that I could reference my book as well for that. So a being which is sexed can be named with a gendered name. A being which is named has status connected with personhood, and that's linked to Bodenhorn's work in anthropology on naming. So sexing also allows a family with a wanted pregnancy to move to the use of gendered pronouns and away from referring to the coming baby as it. And this, in the literature, has been described as uncomfortable for families, despite there being a tradition in English of referring to babies and young children as it, as well as she or he. And that's actually been critiqued in the context of children's rights, but it's quite prevalent in sort of novels and stuff from the 20th century and maybe not so recently. At the same time, pregnancy loss literature describes how knowing the sex of the being which died in pregnancy loss increases its ontological realness, especially when there's doubt about whether the pregnancy did produce a real baby and real parents. So that's my work and Linda Lane's work. Sexing a fetal being or a born baby that dies can support ontological claims to personhood by allowing gendering, including naming with names which may or may not reflect gender. And that's my work for my PhD as well. So at the same time, avoiding knowing sex has been described as a way of protecting the parental self in cases of loss. So in this paper, I'm trying to bring all this together to pay attention to these liminal cases of prenatal, postnatal, and posthumous sexing and gendering of fetal beings. And they're cases of categorizations that don't fit the norm and which disrupt the naturalization of the categories themselves, referring to Bowker and Starr there. So I argue that sexing of the fetal body, which is dead or will die, can challenge current orthodoxies around sexing, gendering, and personhood attribution in the English context, namely that all persons are sexed and gendered, that sex and gender identity is dependent on the agency of the sexed and gendered person, and that personhood is a set of fixed attributes which must include sex and gender. So I'm now going to use my empirical data to explain how the processes of sexing and gendering the fetal body come about, and how knowledge of fetal sex is linked to the gendering of the baby or fetal being, expressed through pronoun use and naming, which are also personhood claims in the context of fetal and early neonatal death. So the period I'm interested in, the second trimester of pregnancy, is really relevant to sexing and gendering because it's when genital formation occurs in the fetus, and there's the possibility of determining fetal sex by ultrasound. And the fetal body is also substantial and developed. So when the NHS mandates labour and birth rather than surgery, women and families often encounter a recognisably human body. And then processes of sexing and gendering in those cases can often align with the processes of sexing babies who live. And the birth declaration moment can be really significant. And Rachel shows this here. Her first daughter was born very prematurely at 23 weeks and died shortly after birth. And Rachel and her husband had decided not to find out the sex in advance by ultrasound a few weeks earlier. But Rachel had intuitively sexed the baby from very early in the pregnancy. And she says, I was adamant all the way through she was a girl. And then when she came out, they said, oh, you've got a daughter. I said, I knew she was a girl. I knew it. And I said to my husband, see, I told you we had a daughter. So this process of moving from an unknown baby to a daughter. So despite the chaos and sadness of Rachel's daughter's extremely premature birth and subsequent death, the process of sexing the baby's body was one that fitted a conventional birth script. Medical staff announced the gendered kinship relationship at the moment of birth. You have a daughter. And of Rachel affirming her motherhood through intuitive knowledge of her child. I told you we had a daughter. So announcing the sex of the baby when it coincided with emergence in the birth process like this was a very powerful moment in which there was a shift from status as anonymous fetus, unconfirmed sex, to a sexed and gendered baby who could be understood as a person. But in the second trimester, death can also interrupt the development of fetal genitals, and definitive sexing through normative anatomy, either antenatally or postnatally, is sometimes not possible. Sometimes the condition of the fetal body after death also makes anatomical sexing difficult. And for those women who really wanted to know the sex of their baby and expected a pronouncement of sex at birth, an absence of certainty could be really disruptive. And people describe seeking certainty in the process of discovering pregnancy loss. So Fiona, she found out at a private ultrasound gender scan that her baby had died. And she was obviously really shocked at this unexpected lack of heartbeat, but she asked the sonographer who confirmed the death to try to determine fetal sex. I remember saying to them, is he a boy or a girl? And then she said, it would be a guess, I can't tell you. But then she showed her, she goes, this is where I'd have to look. So it's on the ultrasound. And to me, now I look back, you probably could see he was a boy, to be honest, but she didn't want to tell me for some reason. I was desperate to know, I don't know why. But I guess you can then associate with him or her, can't you? And when Fiona's son was eventually born, she was still seeking confirmation because it hadn't happened prior to his birth. And she said, I said, he's a boy, isn't he? And the woman said, I'll go and clean him up and I'll bring him back and I'll confirm. I remember smiling weirdly. I remember going to my husband, he's a boy. Like, I don't know. I remember my husband saying, gosh, that moment would be amazing if he was alive. In Fiona's story, you can see the link to the sexing moment in living and born babies, and also the sense of wanting to know in order to gender. And you can see the reluctance of medical staff to sex, where this is unclear in any way, if there hasn't already been chromosomal sexing, and that was really strong in the rest of the data as well. So the reluctance of the healthcare staff to sex based on genital anatomy was really a common theme. The possibility of staff being discovered to have wrongly sexed the dead second trimester newborn probably arose because chromosomal sexing is part of the post-mortem, like I said earlier, and some of them would have been having, not all of them, but some of them would have been having post-mortem. And this is considered the most accurate determination of sex. But post-mortem takes time, and it takes a long time at the moment. There's not enough staff. So some women waited several months for sex to be determined by post-mortem results. And this could cause difficulties in the social existence of the fetal being as a baby or person in the intervening period. And the possibility of misgendering the baby, privately or publicly, was really difficult for some families, as has been noted in intersex literature. So for my participant Tamsin, whose twins died and then were born at 17 weeks of gestation, there was a mismatch between the observed visualized sex at birth and chromosomal sex. So she believed them to be boys, but she gave them fairly gender neutral names. And then subsequently, tissue samples found them to be chromosomally female. And so talking to me not long after this, finding this out, Tamsin moved between different pronouns for her babies and had difficulty settling on a gendered identity for them. And when I asked her about this, she explained she was still seeing them as boys because she was so surprised to find that her intuited and visualized sexing was contradicted by the chromosome analysis. So by contrast, Megan described her relief when her son's chromosomal sex matched the post-mortem assessment. They said at the time when he was born, the midwife said, I think he's a boy. So we made that decision. We just told everyone he was a boy. But about a month afterwards, the hospital phoned me with a genetics test and they said he was male. And I said, was that a relief? And she said, yes, we think it would have been a bit weird if they said, oh, actually, he was a girl. I think it's easier when you're talking to people, isn't it? Rather than like lost a baby, we still don't know what it is. Just made that whole thing a bit easier. And we felt like we could give him a name. So for women like Megan and Tamsin, finding out fetal sex and then building on this to gender their babies was a highly significant moment because persons in Euro-American culture are understood to have a sexed identity as a prerequisite for personhood, according to Lane. Fetal sex and subsequent gendering can therefore be a resource for personhood in contexts such as pre-viability pregnancy loss, where personhood is contested, as my research has shown. So, as in Tamsin's conversations with me, women's use of pronouns in their accounts of second trimester pregnancy loss highlighted periods of uncertainty and ambiguity, and this contrasted with the certainty of gendered pronouns used once sex had been established. So, for example, Angela's account of the birth of her son shows the transition to a gendered personhood, and I've added the dark bits. So talking through what happened, she said it didn't come out. I could feel it there though, and called the midwife, and she had a look and she said, you're about to deliver. So basically, the baby just fell out rather than I actually went into labour because it literally took about 6 minutes to be delivered. So yeah, I got on the bed and delivered, and then she used her son's name. So you can see that transition there. You can see a clear movement from a sort of neuter being to gendered pronouns and then eventually to the actual name of her son. And this echoes Goddard and Saunders' concept of gender slippage, whereby it is less of a person than he is. Similar shifts in pronouns as reflective of a shift in knowledge of fetal sex and personhood attribution were found in lots of different accounts of sex in babies. And the women were often aware of this, and they were explaining carefully how they were trying to use language to express what they knew at the time when they're retrospectively talking about it. So the performance of speech acts around gender had to be correct for each stage of knowledge of the fetal being, and incorrect sexing and gendering of babies in other people's use of language was noted, and it was often experienced as distressing. For example, when the hospital chaplain referred to Amber's daughter as he, and Joelle's midwife filled out the incorrect sex on her baby's paperwork. So certainty about baby's sex placed it in specific kinship relations, especially those of son or daughter to the pregnant woman as a mother. And Angela, who was the one whose son was gradually gendered during the account of her birth above, explained this really clearly by contrasting her multiple pregnancy losses. So she'd had 2 early miscarriages and then lost the boy that died in the second trimester. And he was born alive and then died because of extreme prematurity. And for Angela, this second trimester baby was a full person in the same way as her subsequent living son was a person. She explained how knowledge of sex shifted a fetal being from the more ambiguous fetus to a definite baby with personhood and gendered kinship roles. So she said, the one who died existed, we've had another baby, but I don't mention the other two, the early losses. It's a whole minefield. And I said, so the other losses didn't feel the need to name them or identify them separately. She said, well, I didn't know what they were. And I said, is that because you didn't know if they were male or female? She said, probably. And maybe they didn't have such a formed body, probably. As soon as you know male or female, she said, that's big, one of those big milestones, I would say, in identifying this as a baby or a fetus or alive, or I don't know, that's massive, isn't it? And it's irrelevant what they were, but once you've got it in your head, it's your son or daughter. So knowing the sex meant that a gendered person who might perhaps have lived in different circumstances could be more easily imagined. The determination of sex could produce a gendered person who could have been a living son or daughter in an alternate reality. And that impacted on Stacey's case on the distress and loss, as she explains here. So I said, do you know whether it's a girl or boy? And they said, yes. And that set me off because it was a girl. I just seemed to keep bawling my eyes out. I'd just inconsolable when they told me. And I said, so you had this idea of having a daughter? And said, yeah, because I've got the boy. I wanted the girl, the little girl, you know, mummy's girl and all. I wanted that, pink frilly dresses, you know. If it was a boy, I don't think I would have been as bothered because I've got a boy. But this was a girl that I really, really wanted. So the effect of knowing sex was really huge in a lot of people's cases, but it could also extend to those who didn't want to claim fetal personhood as well. And Paula described the end of her pregnancy through termination for fetal anomaly as the loss of a fetus, not a baby, and she didn't want to know sex. But it became really hard for her to sustain that because her husband did want to know the sex, and he decided to view the fetal body and found out that it was male and told her. And this disrupted Paula's ability to maintain these categorical boundaries around what had been lost. And in my interview with her, she interchanged pronouns of it, he, and sometimes she. And she used the term baby and child and little boy, even though I'd asked her right at the beginning, what's your preferred term? And she'd said fetus. And she still spontaneously came up with these other words. And she also described how several years later, she still imagined the child that might have been in the sequence of her family. So even for people who didn't want to know, the impact of the knowledge was quite strong in terms of creating forms of personhood. Certainty about fetal sex made claims to personhood stronger and produced a more clearly imagined daughter or son who could have lived. By contrast, whilst definite fetal sex and gender attributions made more of a person, for some families in my research, certainty either wasn't required or it wasn't wanted. So for some women, fetal sex and gender ambiguity allowed them a bit more scope in the specific definition of their own experience, especially in relation to degree or type of personhood, often in relation to other fetal beings or living children. So many of the women had had early miscarriages or abortions which were unsexed and which they didn't consider the loss of a person in the same way as their experience of second trimester loss. So Kerry had no desire to know the sex of the fetus she had aborted some years before, but she was very interested in gendering the subsequent baby who died spontaneously at 20 weeks gestation. And it was of huge importance to her that he was recognised as a son and the son of her partner. At the same time, the gendered name that they picked for him wasn't one that they would have chosen for a baby that had lived. And Kerry didn't feel this choice of a name was very important. She needed a name, which they kind of picked one. And Helen made similar choices about naming, not using her favourite girl's name in case she had another baby in future. And in these cases, combinations of parental intention, fetal development, fetal sex, and the possibility or not of a fetal future produced the second trimester baby as partial persons, not quite as much a person as the living siblings or the possible future living babies that might come along. For other people, personhood wasn't connected to sex or gender. So Louise's first baby died during a termination for fetal anomaly. And she felt very strongly that the sex and consequent gender of the baby was irrelevant, but that the baby was a person and she was a mother to it. And her lack of interest in the sex and gender of her baby derived from her Christian position on the lack of importance of the physical body. And this was quite interesting because she had also had a termination. So it was, and her church knew about that. So she said, for me, I guess my beliefs are that your body's just the body, it's your spirit. And when the spirit's gone, it's gone to heaven. And that's why partly why I didn't want to see the body either, because it was more of a thing of that's your vessel. But when someone dies, the spirit's gone. So this did, she chose a name for a baby that wasn't very strongly gendered, and she moved between pronouns when she was referring to the baby, most often using it. But during our conversation, she did now and again use he. And at one point she told me that in her head it was a he. And then actually they found out from a form that it was a girl, but this didn't affect what she felt about the baby's sex or gender. From our perspective, it was a case of, yes, this baby will never be a baby. So it was never going to be a baby boy or a baby girl. It was a non-gender. And I said, so you still feel like a name was relevant? She said, I think we did, because we thought, what are we going to say? Otherwise, we're just going to call it, the baby. But we never actually used the name or refer to it. So for Louise, the baby was a person in the sense of having a human spirit, but not a gender, and the sex body was unimportant compared to the baby's ultimate existence and her own relation as mother to the baby. So, in conclusion, the experiences of women after second trimester pregnancy loss complicates ideas of both fetal and general personhood in England. My participants' accounts show that knowing fetal sex with a degree of certainty is strongly determinative of gendering, which implies personhood and is reinforced through social interactions using gendered pronouns or names, which themselves affirm personhood. So this sits alongside previous research in Euro-American context, which describes the fetal body as the location and origin of personhood. So Conklin and Morgan and Franklin have written in that area. Also, which shows how evidence of the fetal body is used in making personhood claims in contested personhood. That's my other work. And which understands sex category differentiation to be a naturalized basis in human interactions. That's West and Zimmerman. So certainty about fetal sexing can be produced through conventional visualization of genital morphology, which can be done by kin after birth or diagnosed through biomedical techniques. And when sex is uncertain or types of sexing conflict with each other, then gendering is unmoored and becomes less stable. In these cases, participants expressed uncertainty about fetal gender status and also moved between pronouns when referring to the dead fetal being. But less stable gender doesn't necessarily mean less personhood. Certainty in sexing and gendering may make a being more of a person, but it can also be a form of person without being a definite he or she. And this is reminiscent of the old-fashioned habit in England of referring to born babies as it. And it also offers a slightly different perspective on interpretations of that as problematic in not representing those people as fully human. Also, personhood can exist without certainty of sex and gender or without a defined sex and gender at all, such as in Louise's baby's case. And different families place different degrees of importance on tying down sex and gender categories. So in contrast to assumptions made by doctors in intersex cases, my participants show that parental conformity to dichotomous systems of sex and gender categorization is not absolute. For some, persons must have bodies, and this includes sex. For others, not all persons require developed human bodies or to be clearly sexed. And this might be particularly the case when there are no further consequences of missexing or misgendering the person who won't live. So as I've noted in my previous work, persons in England can exist prenatally and posthumously without independent life. And the legal personhood threshold of live birth doesn't reflect the range of conceptualizations of personhood that exist in the kinship context in England. And in this paper, I show the social practices of gendering, such as naming and pronoun use, whether they're based on sex certainty or not, disrupt binaries of personhood when they produce the fetal being or baby as more of a person. So overall, in the case of fetal and newborn babies which die, sex and gender are sufficient but not necessary conditions for personhood in the English context. And I'm also arguing that paying attention to these tensions between normative categories and actual practices of categorization is productive of new knowledge about sex and gender and the relationship between these concepts. So drawing on Bowker and Starr's attention to things that don't fit into categorization, and also Butler's concept of unintelligible bodies. And they're relevant to these fetal beings that die, as well as being relevant as they've been used before in relation to intersex or transgender persons. So key point here is that intersex and transgender persons can disrupt sex and gender categories because their own agency as living persons may not accord with biomedical and social categorizations of their bodies. And projected ongoing life brings in a new diagnostic category criteria around sex beyond chromosomal and genital anatomy sexing. So living persons who are challenging these categories, other things like physiological sex, puberty, gamete production, internal reproductive organs can come into play as producing the sex beings. And parents in that situation take into account imagined futures, according to Timmermans et al. And those futures are social and yet connected to the material biological body. And for living persons whose desired gender doesn't accord with their biological sex characteristics, some surgical adaptation is possible. By contrast, in the case of fetal beings or babies which have died, there's no future-oriented biology to draw on and no future social agency in deciding their own sex or gender. So sexing and gendering in those cases isn't done or performed agentially in some way because there is no subject in the case of fetal sex when there isn't and will not be a future life. So any sexing and gendering that happens is socially produced. Interpretations of the fetal body can be a resource for its sexing and gendering, and the impetus to define sex in the dead fetal being is an impetus to gender based on that sex. And where real sex is uncertain, this can impact on gender, and that looks like the traditional pattern of real sex determining gender. However, I argue that sex and gender are not the only categories of thought here, and that personhood is disruptive of both of them. And alongside biomedical and parental sexing and gendering, this paper shows a parallel impetus to attribute forms of personhood, especially by kin, which can at times be unsexed and ungendered. And in practice in England, personhood attribution can draw on the resources of the body, but it's not limited to the body. And this analysis therefore notes and yet slightly sidesteps academic arguments about which of the concepts of biological sex or social gender is more real or foundational or original than the other, even slightly challenges whether they're a connected pair at all. So instead, I'm putting sex and gender in relation to a spectrum of personhood and in complex relationship to each other, using the disruption of second trimester pregnancy loss and the fetal beings that are encountered. And this is a different way of thinking through entanglements of the body, sex, gender, and personhood. And it produces new ways of thinking about each of those, derived from the complex ways of thinking that were actually developed in everyday life by my participants when they were faced with the dead body of their fetus or baby. And ambiguity and certainty can exist and shift through time and experience, even in relation to such basic questions as, is this a person and is it a girl or a boy? So this is just quickly to recognise the women who participated in the research and those who requested it, the babies that died. And the rest of the research is in that book. Should be interesting.
Thank you very much. Kind of really fascinating set of kind of concepts, but also very, I imagine that a lot of those interviews were quite hard in various ways. So great respect for all of those different parts of it. I guess I'm tempted to start with a question about the kind of ideas about when the fetus is ensouled, but I think I will kind of draw back from that. I guess one of the things I was thinking about was, partly from your title, was the kind of importance of language, or whether some of this is, whether language can be actually taken out from some of the kind of cultural social stuff, because I was thinking both, this is pre-they. So nobody would have thought of.
It's not really.
Well, yeah, okay. So that would be my question. Was they?
No, I have. That's really interesting because I did think that during.
And then the other question would be whether this is specific to English as a non-gendered language, and if fetus has a gender, whether. So those were just two questions that were, yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think I would always say it's very specific to the English context in the Southwest this time and all the rest of it. Anyway, But I was really struck by the lack of they, because it seems like a really obvious solution. And some of the people, the ones that were older, I think, were maybe not in that lesson. But I don't know, I mean, this, yeah, I think most of them probably were aware of that possibility, but didn't use it. But I also am not sure that they were always deliberately using it. Some people were, and some people were kind of shifting around between it and they. And we do say, what is it? You know, when we say, is it a girl or a boy? And that's the shift that happens. So I think that's already in people's head. And that's the question they're asking in the ultrasound situation and everything. Anyway, what is it? And that's sort of to do with the feature of English. That's the way we phrase that question. So you're right that I think probably language is really important in this. And there is a woman who does linguistic stuff around pregnancy loss who might well be interested in that, actually. But I think I don't really have the expertise to do more than I have in thinking of it as a social presence, using different pronouns. But yeah, because they would be a good solution, wouldn't it? Well, or maybe it is fine. Maybe it is fine. Yeah. And it really does.
Usually in English, when you have fetus, it's always it.
Yeah.
I wonder when I was translating into English things. So it's usually it's it.
Yeah.
You would use it. Okay.
Yeah. What alternatives do you have then?
No, I was wondering if you already try always to use he or she or he, maybe. I don't know, because in Italian you would use the masculine. Since we don't have the neutral, you would use you would use the remainder of the Latin neutrum, which is esso, which is I mean it's not properly masculine, I would say, because it's really a reminder of the neutral. But we don't have any more neutral in Italian, so it would be more towards the masculine. But yeah, that's why I was wondering, maybe you always use he to avoid something that looks like, I don't know. I was also wondering if you use it for the entire pregnancy. That was the point. If there is a moment when it becomes,
I think if people have the ultrasound, then it becomes he or she. Yeah, but not interestingly, a lot of people still don't find out the sex in ultrasound. A lot of people say no, and so a lot of people do go through the 9 months without knowing. Yeah, never mind in these situations. And it is, the thing that made me notice it a lot is that there's this children's book called Mog and the Baby, you know, Judith Kerr book, and all the way through that it's about an encounter between a cat and a baby, and the baby is referred to as it the entire time. It did this, it did that, and that it reads okay in English, and we sort of do say it quite a lot about babies and small children, but then it also has, so people have critiqued it from a kind of social working type perspective, saying that it's dehumanizing. But I'm not convinced it is, actually. I think, well, that's part of my argument, really. Maybe we could have some more pronouns.
There's often the referral of just baby.
Yes. And without using the name as well.
Of just like, you know, is baby doing this? Is baby doing that? I mean, all of the midwives I saw would refer to baby.
But then they refer to you as mum usually.
Yeah, mum and baby. I mean, probably.
How are you doing, mum?
It's useful to not have to remember millions of names, I guess. But
yeah, but they do say baby, and also obviously midwives, when they're doing antenatal care, say baby the whole way.
Yeah.
Like as soon as you get into that, it's baby, mum and dad. And mum, whatever. Yeah. So it's all very conforming anyway.
Hannah.
Yeah, I was wondering whether like maybe the continued use of it like post is something to do with like when the child itself starts exhibiting gendered behaviour.
Could be, couldn't it? Or even starts to speak.
Yeah.
Maybe. I don't know. But it is a sort of, also that thing, you know, years ago they used to dress them in the same clothes until they were like out of toddlerhood, and I think maybe it was less important but like to do that. But I don't think it's necessarily undermining of their person.
I actually got told off the other day by a friend because my sister's pregnant and I referred to the baby as it, and she was like, no, you can't do that. And I
So what did they suggest?
I think because they didn't know, my sister doesn't know the sex of the baby, so
Maybe it's changing.
yeah.
Maybe it's changed. Yeah.
Thanks, Aimee. That was really great, and it felt like really tight. And I thought it was like submit it. Like it feels really ready, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I didn't have a very well formed question, but it's about when people do want certainty about what they then do with that, because clearly a lot of it is internal. I want to know. And a lot of it was about that kinship relationship. I am a mum now because I have a daughter. But you got the bit of names, so like the importance of like gender and names. But quite a few people were talking about the conversations that they were then planning with having with other people,
Yeah.
and that they wanted this so that when they were speaking to other people, they could have that kind of certainty. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that. And then was that gendering important for example, objects? You know, were people wanting to buy a teddy and
Yeah,
you know, it has to have the pink bow or the blue bow?
Yeah,
So
outside of of that stuff is in the book.
You're gonna plug it.
In which they talk about like the social resourcing of it, and also, for example, the person that talked about wanting the little girl. I mean, I actually can't remember how much detail I put in of this, but she had these shelves that were entirely pink and entirely mummy's little girl and angels and kind of really gendered memorialization. So for some people that was really huge, and she was very much wanted me to interact with these objects and see what she had. But other people a lot less so, and I think that's probably just what a variety of different forms of parenting, whereas some people are right into that from the beginning and other people are a bit more neutral about it.
And so were those memorials tended to be gendered, like, you know, like the pink stuff?
I would say that most people that I interviewed had some idea or had made a decision about, but not everyone. And the person the Christian Louise had just one photo in her house that just showed feet, and that's all she'd looked at. And it looked almost like, because you don't know the scale, it could be just one of her other children or something. And it just that she pointed it out. I didn't realise that it was a memorial photo until she pointed it out. So she was, not everybody did that at all, actually. Lots of people didn't have anything they showed me in their house on show. So that was a particular form of asserting personhood and asserting what had happened to them anyway, to make a public space in your house that you sort of draw attention to in some way. And a lot of people didn't do that at all, actually. So maybe I have no idea whether they were the ones that correlated with less interest, or if it was just coincidence. But it was the sort of contested personhood stuff that often made people do that assertion a little bit more strongly, I think. And actually also quite often, some of the people who'd had terminations, I think, I was still a parent, you know, there was some stuff about that as well. Just because it was an abortion doesn't mean that it wasn't something important to me. And actually, if I'm thinking off the top of my head, quite a few of those people did have something in their front room. So I don't know if I answered your question. I've gone off a bit. But yeah.
Just to just to say to those online, if you do want to ask a question, just put up a virtual hand or wave at me or whatever. But anyway, yeah.
I found it was also interesting, this tension between like the parents who, to feel they know their baby, they want to gender them, because at that stage, as you say, you completely conflate the gender and the sex, because there's no reality of gender, it's the baby. So even why you want to know the sex, there's also this voyeurism, which is a bit, you know, like why you need to know that, what it would change in your imaginary, and also to kind of hide the violence about attributing a sex to someone. And I was wondering on that also, if the state forces you to gender your baby, or can you choose, for example, the nurse say, oh, it's a boy. Can you choose to still put on the paper that you don't want?
So there's no official, unless it's alive, and only alive as certified by a doctor, not if you thought it was alive and everybody didn't notice. There's no state link at all. So what you can do is there's a sort of unofficial certificate that you can get online, but you don't have to gender on sex or anything on that. So in relation to the state, that this is kind of what my book was about the fact that these experiences aren't really visible because they're pre-viability, and therefore they can't produce a person from the state's point of view. So I think the only time that would happen would be if there was a live birth at this point, at which point they would fairly definitely go for post-mortem, and then you'd have to wait, and then it would all have to be sort of sorted out at the point when you did birth registration. But you would have to do a birth and death registration, and I think you can probably. It's a good point about I haven't got a pen. Somebody's pen. Thank you. About whether if you'd have to wait for, because I think there's a time limit on birth registration, so I don't know if you have to wait for this sex attribution from post-mortem, if you didn't know, but I don't think I have a case for that, because the ones that were alive were so much more developed that you could sex them visually, if you see what I mean. So, but it could be there's a time gap, in which case maybe you'd have to do a gender recognition certificate if you wanted to have those things line up. But I think this is quite interesting. One of the reasons I know about the midwife notification being separate from is because when my son was born, they put the wrong label on him, the sticker, and I was like, why does it say on this sticker M? Because it's got my name and his name, and it's oh no, F. And I'm like, oh, I am female, yes, because I gave birth to him. Why does it say F on his sticker? And they were like, oh my God. And it was really funny, because apparently there's a 10-day window after birth, at which point they enter that details into a national computer that can never be changed. And we would, apparently if we'd gone to the 10-day thing, we would have had to do a gender recognition certificate for him. And apparently that does happen now and again over the course of the year. Some people get caught in this weird system. Why could you not change it? And also, what is that about? So there is a funny notification thing going on there. I mean, I don't know. And also, that's the form that says gender on it.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. It's really weird. So it's super interesting. These things, like, especially the bureaucracy, sort of accrete over time, and there's a really huge thing in this country between what happens with stillbirth after 24 weeks and what happens pre-24 weeks in terms of entitlements to maternity leave and paternity leave and child bereavement leave and all the things, lots of things that people wouldn't get in other circumstances. So if somebody's baby dies on the neonatal unit, they won't get 9 months maternity leave, but if it died before it was born, they will get 9 months maternity leave. There's so many inconsistencies, and obviously you only know this if this actually happens in some way. But you can, because stillbirth registration, it was a criminal thing, and then it got accreted into a kind of personhood recognition, state recognition of stillbirths. And then the parents' names got added, and the name of the baby got added, and all this stuff got added to stillbirth registration. It changed into a form of civil registration. Is one of my arguments in my book again. But I have to keep kind of referring to that, just so that you know where I'm getting it from. Yeah, so that's really interesting. There's like loads of anomalies in how registration and the interaction between the person and the state and the family comes about, really. Yeah. Sorry, I hope I'm blasted you again. It's because I sort of presented it as I wrote it.
This is picking up on what we were talking about before, really, but I'm wondering what role the wider, if your participants talked about their parents or their siblings, and if that played a role in, if kind of the gendering played an important role to them in terms of attributing personhood. I'm just thinking of my own experience of how obsessed parts of my family were about, in a way that I was not in any way, about like finding out. So irritated with me that I kept saying no. But it does play its part in terms of that process, and I'm wondering about how much that had influence, or whether they reflected on that.
And sometimes some of the issues that came up were where the family were a bit dismissive of what had happened, and then it was almost used as an assertion of reality and personhood. So where people, wider family, were dismissive, oh, you just had a miscarriage, what are you making a fuss about, kind of thing, and they'd be like, no, it was a girl, this is her name, use her name. You know, so sometimes that was quite a sort of assertive political act in itself of trying to combat. And then in situations where families were more in tune with what the women were thinking, I think it did So people quite often talked about grandparents grieving a granddaughter or something like that, and having, some of them had the pictures in their house or whatever. So I think it did connect, but more through the personhood idea, like, was it real, and did it really happen, and was this really my grandchild or not? Because that's so kind of contentious in this area, but it adds to the power.
Yeah.
It was really good, thank you. I think what's really fascinating is how you could kind of take like the Rose idea of molecularization from like the post-50s onwards, and thinking about like the soul before that, and how you can look at this kind of fascination for determining sex in the fetus as a really good indicator of that. Just enormous transition, how personhood is determined. So it's not the kind of theological ensoulment, but it's rather a kind of chromosomal molecular determination that then kind of.
But then I don't think I'm arguing that people think that because they don't need to have the sex knowledge for there still to be a person. So it's not really replacing.
So then it is still a
kind of own
recapitulation of the.
But I don't know, but it's sort of more embodied than the soul. Like it's more, so the encounter with the body is the significant point, I think, because rather than a soul, because they're almost always dead or very quickly dead. And although people did talk about a presence in the room for some of the living ones that briefly lived, they're mostly encountering a dead body that looks human, and that's the kind of key trigger compared to their previous pregnancy loss experiences, which were just blood or matter. And it was the formation was really, so I think the formation, the morphology is really important, right? Apart from for Louise, where I think there's an element of that as well, but I'm not sure that personhood is like a soul thing. It's more like that's a human, and it looks like a human, or more or less like a human. There was a bit of that as well.
Yeah.
I know what you mean.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it's so kind of slippery. So.
Yeah. I forgot about the English thing with the language. I should have asked you more.
The other thing was just thinking how interesting it would be if somebody does another study similar to this in like 20, 50 years.
Yeah.
You know,
It'll have shifted.
just something that will be built up in time, and that will.
Because also, I mean, it didn't come up in my work, but if you have IVF, you can know chromosomal sex very early, and then that's a different experience altogether. If there's a loss or isn't a loss, or if you just know that, how does that structure the coming into being bit of pregnancy? I don't know. And that was included.
I was wondering, I don't know in UK how it works, but is there for the, let's say the politics of the death for these fetuses, are there in symmetry or something like that? So which would maybe also explain why you would want to give a name and this kind of.
Well, it's all changed quite a lot in the last 30 years, really, I'd say. And there is the possibility of doing some, so there's generally, you can either have so it's really complicated, but it came about with the Human Tissue Act after, in the UK, lots of hospitals were storing children's body parts at Alder Hey and at Bristol, like children's hearts and things, without people's permission. And so after that, the Human Tissue Act started regulating everything. And so now your options, if you have pregnancy remains, are you have this thing called sensitive incineration, incinerated separately to legs or something. So incinerated separately, or you can do burial or cremation. Or you can, if it's before 24 weeks, you can take the baby and do what you want with it, the body, and do what you want with it, because it's not a person. So it's not the same as, unless it was born alive, in which case you can't. So, there's all this cross-cutting. There's cross-cutting of viability and live birth that make all these things happen to do with personhood, basically. And so traditionally, no, we didn't allow particularly fetuses to be buried in in cemeteries, and particularly in church ones, but now there's much more flexibility about that. But people do all sorts of things, basically. And I've got a colleague who does research into early pregnancy loss and what people want done with the remains, because people get a bit freaked out by the Human Tissue Act. What do you want to happen when they've just had a termination or an early miscarriage? But it's sort of imposed on them to decide. And then some people, there's a couple of groups of people are doing research that shows that people don't really want that choice always, or they want another choice, which is, I don't want to know. And so like all of this stuff is connected into how we make people and how they're disposed of. And yeah.
You kind of need to generate we need to generate a kind of social process that does the work of a funeral or whatever it is for that. And so, I mean, it's much less important work, but that would not be quite the right word. But you need a kind of accepted process, don't you? So that people don't have to decide.
Yeah. And at the moment there isn't really work, and it's all very heightened compared to your permission about your leg. You don't get your leg cremated; it gets removed. It's really, but pregnancy remains. And then also there's a really funny thing about why crematoria won't take anything that they're not absolutely sure is the fetal body and not the placenta or something. And it's like, because of their regulation, of the cremation regulation, is completely separate, and it's got to be somewhere human, but it's not registered human. You're like, what do you mean? And it gets so complicated. But that's super.
Hannah, and then we'll draw the formal part of the proceedings to a close. Yeah.
So that's so interesting about the bureaucracy. But my question was actually about something we talked about previously, and I was wondering whether so like sex is like part somehow of like how people understand the personhood of their children, even if it doesn't necessitate that personhood. But I was wondering if like other qualities of the fetus rather affected the understanding of its personhood, like other birth anomalies, for example. So I was thinking of a study that came up in my own research from like the 50s with a doctor who's like looking at the sex of what he describes as anencephalic. And like how
that's really interesting, because I did have a case, a woman who had a termination for fetal I can't speak anymore, fetal anomaly for that condition, and that was so interesting. So that was more about, again, was this really a person? And she did assert that, and she said, even though she didn't really look quite like a person, looked a bit funny, but to me, and was able to kind of do that. Whereas there were other cases where somebody showed her mum a picture and the mum went, oh, at least it doesn't look like a proper baby. And there was that kind of, so there was so I did at various points think that it's kind of got a disability morphology, kind of what's a proper shape, but I didn't really have enough data to quite do that. But I think there's probably something in that as well, like what's the right shape, and at what point does what comes out in a miscarriage twist into something recognisably human? And because it does seem to make a big difference, but then also it's produced by the NHS not offering surgical management because they don't have enough people who are willing to do what is basically a surgical abortion on a late-term fetus, and so they don't offer it. So it pushes everybody into this encounter.
That was the case.
No, nobody knows. This is the other awful thing.
Can you repeat again, because I'm not sure I understood.
Sorry.
Sorry. No, it's complicated. Sorry.
So in up to about 13 weeks of pregnancy, you can have surgery. Well, about 13 to 16 weeks, you can have surgery that removes the fetal body and everything. But in this country, after that, you can't. You have to expel it, because we don't. It's not that it's not possible. It is possible, but we don't have surgeons that are willing to do it. So not enough, because it's an abortion.
Because you can somehow, as a physician, or a doctor, you can object.
Yeah. So in this country, for the one thing you can object to, you have to do everything else, but you can say no to abortion related. Yeah, it's the same in many countries. So that means that the 3,000 women in England and Wales a year that have a termination for fetal anomaly that's discovered about 20 weeks, when they do the scan at 20 weeks, it's too late for surgery. So you have to, and nobody knows that in advance.
So either you find someone who's willing to do that.
You won't find anyone on the NHS. You have to pay, maybe. I don't think. The private providers that do it for non-fetal anomaly abortions in certain very rare cases when they're that late, which is not very often. So basically, all the people who get who go through, and nobody know. I think it's a consent issue because you go for your anomaly scan at 20 weeks to see if there's anything wrong with the baby, and nobody says to you, if there isn't, this is the process.
Yeah.
You just go, oh, and this was again in my the rest of my research that people go, oh, I just thought they'd take it away. I just thought it would go, and nobody realizes that then no, you come in and you're 3 days in labour, and then you've got retained placenta, and then we'll take you into surgery for the placenta, but not for removal. And it's really, it's a real lack of choice, and it's not consented fully, I think, and people don't know about it in advance of the 20-week scan, which is, you know, it's quite a substantial body. I think that's wrong, but anyway, I don't know how we tell everybody.
Yeah, I have follow-up questions about what countries is that different in, but I think for now we should just thank you very much indeed, Amy. And there's a party next door after that.
Everyone needs to remember this seminar date for next year. You bid in that you get to be the one with the party after.
Yeah, yeah, there's all sorts of good things. So are there any countries where you don't have to?
We've got really good general access because a lot of countries don't even have like they're funny about an anomaly
Okay.
anyway. So
Okay.
so we've got some very good
In the US, for example, can you, because I'm just thinking where places
where you would have, I don't know, I'd be surprised if they do surgical at that stage. And if you, I'm thinking a lot of places in the US
You're working.
weren't allowed to measure.
Yeah, now
anyway,
it's a real
anyway after 20 weeks, because a lot of people do 20-week.
Yeah.
A lot of countries.
You're thinking of places that are more where the incentives for
With Chris.
Oh, it's
The other day. Yeah, that's me.
more expensive activities.
Very nice man.
It's interesting because
Yeah.
that seems to be quite a step
Best to have around.
Yes, yeah, he was like
in terms of
I have a supervision.
actually encouraging more prenatal
Norris.
but at the same time,
His works on, I guess, psychiatric history.
Yeah.
in some respects, it's kind of saying
Now
it's a good idea to know,
Yes.
understand your risks.
Nice.
Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, no, I'm looking
But
forward
then to not say what the
to it.
I mean, I think that would be really